Senator Moran.
Chairman, thank you. Thank you all for your presence here and your testimony. Mr. Crowden, let me start with you. We've advocated for unlicensed spectrum, and in my view, it's been very successful in bringing new technologies, new devices to lots of consumers across the country. I'm of the belief that we must continue to pursue spectrum policy that includes both unlicensed and licensed. I would ask you just briefly if you agree with those comments, but my real question is, what role will unlicensed spectrum play in the deployment of 5G, or if any?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I unequivocally agree with that comment. Unlicensed spectrum, by any objective standard, unlicensed spectrum in general and Wi-Fi in particular has been the most successful policy in the history of the United States from a spectrum policy standpoint in terms of total tonnage of traffic, in terms of the efficient utilization of the spectrum, and in terms of the economic impact that Wi-Fi has brought to the economy. So there's no question that we need to continue to advocate for unlicensed growth. We are approaching exhaust with Wi-Fi, and that is a critical concern that we should address. As far as unlicensed spectrum for 5G, it's critical. It's definitely part of the equation. So when we talk about 5G, there is a technology standard body that was referenced, 3GPP, that talks about 5G standards. There also is another body, IEEE, and I won't get too wonkish here, but that guides Wi-Fi technology standards. So Wi-Fi has its own technology roadmap, right? And one of those roadmaps is different technology variants, 802.11ad and AY, won't get any more than that, that really talks about providing services in the 60 gigahertz layer or millimeter wave spectrum using Wi-Fi, right? And so Wi-Fi will be critical in terms of the future growth of 5G-like services. It'll just be on a licensed spectrum instead of licensed spectrum.
Maybe this is perhaps a question for all. I serve in the role as the Appropriations Subcommittee Chairman for the group of entities at the Department of Commerce that includes NTIA, the National Telecommunications Information Administration. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions about NTIA, and I would start with the President's budget, the 2019 budget proposed authorization for NTIA to, quote, negotiate leases with private entities that would expand their access to federal spectrum. What kind of impact is this proposal expected to have on traditional licensing arrangements, and what are the barriers to effectively administering leases?
I could take that.
Brenner, thank you.
Senator, in the private sector, spectrum leasing is extraordinarily common. There are applications filed every day where different private sector companies lease spectrum from one another. The issue arises because the federal government has certain spectrum that they may not use 24/7 or they may not use coast to coast, so they have either in time or in location or even a part of a band as opposed to a whole band that they could make available. And in the private sector, it would be done with a lease, and with the federal government, there isn't actually an easy way to do that. And I think the proposal is to create a way to do that, and that will only provide better connectivity wherever the spectrum happens to be available. What we don't want to do is, if spectrum isn't available nationwide, and it isn't available 24/7, but it could be made available in pockets of time or geography, we ought to take advantage of that instead of just throwing up our hands and saying, sorry, the federal government can't lease spectrum.
So this has potential. The issue is how to get the federal government to behave the way that the private sector already does.
To allow the federal government to behave that way, right.
I think we've looked for innovative ways for the government to use their spectrum more efficiently, and this is an idea. I will say that we led the world in 4G because of licensed, and I think this work that you've done on the Spectrum Relocation Fund deserves a lot of credit, and we appreciate that. Sometimes relocation just may be a better option, as in the FAA, for instance. They could get their sensor radar, and we could get the spectrum, and it's a win-win opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks for mentioning the Spectrum Relocation Fund Act. In that regard, in the 20 seconds I have left, NTIA was directed by the Mobile Act now to report to Congress with recommendations to incentivize federal agencies to relinquish and share federal spectrum for commercial wireless broadband. Does CTIA have suggestions, Ms. Baker, for this committee and NTIA in what additional incentives might look like?
We're working closely with NTIA. I think that one of the reasons that the Airwaves Act is so important is because they establish a schedule, and sometimes we all operate better when we have a deadline.
My deadline has expired 16 seconds ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Moran.